I'm Gabriel, and this is The Rare Mind. Today we're uncovering why INFJs and INTJs get caught in invisible chains of attachment that outsiders rarely see. From the sacred weight of early bonds to the myths that feed toxic loyalty. Stay with me until the end, because I'll show you how breaking these traps is actually the doorway into real love attachment. For most, is a thread lightly tied easily loosened with time. But for INFJs and INTJs, it is a rope woven deep into the psyche, binding not just memory, but identity itself. What others release as a passing connection, these types carry as a hidden weight long after the relationship has ceased to nourish them. The exhaustion of such caring is rarely visible to others, yet it burns quietly in the background of daily life, shaping choices, moods, and even the body's vitality. The early bonds of these types often feel sacred, etched in stone rather than written in sand. To detach is to feel as though one is betraying not only the other, but the sacred vow of loyalty within. The INFJ may see detachment as moral failure, while the INTJ may interpret it as strategic weakness, as if letting go meant breaking their own inner logic. I know this inner resistance well. I once stayed tied to someone long past the point of health, believing my departure would desecrate something eternal. Shadow loyalty then becomes the invisible chain. Jung understood the shadow as the unacknowledged dimension of the seek, the part we deny, but act from unconsciously. For INFJs, this shadow often drives them to remain loyal even when the bond has turned corrosive, because the loyalty feels like the last thread holding meaning together. For INTJs, the shadow loyalty may cloak itself as efficiency. I've invested so much already, I must see this through. Yet both are forms of entrapment, loyalty distorted into bondage. From the outside, these dynamics are almost never understood. Friends may ask, why don't you just leave? But the depth of inner architecture, the mix of intuition, loyalty, and private mythos makes such detachment more than a rational decision. It is a dismantling of a hidden cathedral built inside, brick by brick, over years. To step away is not merely to walk out of a room, but to tear down the very architecture of meaning one has lived within. The silent burden is real. INFJs and INTJs endure a weight unseen, and too often the world admires their strength, their endurance, their quiet, dedication. But beneath this admiration lies a hidden fatigue, a soul taxed by unseen ties. Sometimes it just hurts. To recognize this truth is not weakness, it is the first step to freedom, a practice. Pause when you feel compelled to stay just one more year, one more effort. Ask, am I staying out of love or out of fear of betraying an image I once created? That simple question can cut through illusions like a blade through fog. The paradox is sharp. To release what no longer serves is not betrayal, but fidelity to the deeper truth. The cathedral can be rebuilt this time, not around another person, but around the sacred rhythm of your own becoming. Who, then, do you betray more by staying the other or yourself? Jung taught that the shadow is not simply darkness, it is the unacknowledged half of the soul, the neglected energy that drives our choices without our consent. When it comes to attachment, the shadow often feels invisible chains that bind INFJs and INTJs to relationships, long after their light has dimmed. What seems like loyalty is, in truth, unconscious fear. What feels like devotion is, at times, hidden control. For INFJs, the shadow often carries the fear of abandonment. The inner wound whispers that if they release the bond, they will not only lose the other, but confirm a deeper suspicion that they are fundamentally unloved. This fear, unspoken but sharp, drives them to overstay, to overgive, to over. I remember sitting in a dim cafe once, stirring coffee gone cold, knowing a relationship had already died, but feeling unable to leave because leaving meant facing silence. For INTJs, the shadow tends to cloak itself in the language of control. What appears as loyalty may in fact be a disguised strategy, the belief that by staying, adjusting, or fixing the system, they can eventually shape the other into alignment. But beneath this strategy lies an unconscious terror that without control, they will be powerless against loss. The loyalty is not pure, it is stained with the need to dominate uncertainty. Attachments, then, are rarely about the other person alone. They become projections of our denied needs. The INFJs need to be chosen. The INTJs need to be secure in mastery. The beloved becomes a mirror, reflecting back the parts of the psyche one refuses to own. To break free is not only to let go of the other, it is to reclaim those projections. To say, what I sought in you is what I must face in me. Shadow work is the doorway. Here, to sit with the fear, to name the hidden motive, to ask with ruthless compassion, why do I stay? What am I really protecting? This practice turns unconscious chains into visible links, and once visible, they can be broken. The sound of metal snapping is never pleasant, but it is the only sound that heralds liberation. I want to hear from you. Which trap resonates the most? Right now, silent endurance, the hope fixation, or fear of emptiness? Write it in the comments, even in one line. Nenemi. It is already a small release, and I'll be reading to see how we can refine these insights together. One sentence holds the weight of this truth. Real loyalty is only possible after we free ourselves from false chains. Otherwise, what we call devotion is merely fear in disguise. And what is love if built on fear? Beneath many INFJ and INTJ attachments lies a myth so radiant it blinds. For INFJs, it is the belief that one day, someone will arrive who fully sees them, every layer, every silence, every unspoken thought. For INTJs, it is the conviction that there exists a partner who will never disappoint, whose reliability will mirror the precision of their own inner order. These myths glow like constellations, distant, unreachable, yet guiding every step. But the myth does not stay gentle. It becomes a binding loop, a loyalty that clings even when the bond has soured. The INFJ sees no one else has ever understood me like this, mistaking partial recognition for eternal. Destiny, the INTJ insists, they have the potential to never let me down, mistaking temporary alignment for permanence. I once caught myself staring at a message thread at 2 a.m., replaying old words as if they held the promise of ultimate recognition. It was not hope, it was captivity. The cruel truth is that such perfect understanding does not exist. Human beings are fragmented, inconsistent, and incapable of reading the full depths of another soul. To wait for the one who sees all is to wait forever. To demand the one who never disappoints is to demand the impossible. These illusions feed toxic bonds because they paint red flags with golden light, convincing the heart that rarity equals inevitability. And yet, who could not fall for such myths? The longing for recognition is sacred. The longing for constancy is noble. But to confuse longing with reality is to step into quicksand. The more one struggles to prove the myth true, the deeper one sinks. Sometimes it just hurts. And sometimes the only way out is to stop fighting for a fantasy and to accept the partial, imperfect love that real humans offer. Here's the practice. When you catch yourself clinging to someone because they get me like no one else, or they never fail me, pause. Ask, is this a real person I love, or an illusion I refuse to release? The question cuts like a blade, but it also frees. Mercy withdrawn is mercy reborn. To step away from the myth is not to abandon love, it is to give love back. It's true, form-flawed, fragile, but alive. There is a peculiar ache in both INFJs and INTJs. The conviction that love requires fixing. For the INFJ, it is the impulse to rescue the broken, to pour their energy into mending wounds that are not theirs to heal. For the INTJ, it is the belief that a partner's flaws are puzzles to be solved, inefficiencies to be optimized. Both fall into the same trap the savior complex, a devotion that quietly turns into control. The INFJ feels it as moral duty. When they sense pain in another, they cannot help but absorb it, carrying it as though their empathy were a sacred vessel. To walk away feels cruel, even if the bond drains them. The INTJ, in contrast, approaches the same scenario like a strategist. If I apply the right insight, if I adjust the plan, I can perfect this bond. I once caught myself doing this staying, not because love was alive, but because the idea of failure was intolerable. Here, I don't just describe patterns like the savior complex or the rare bond illusion. I break down why they hold you and how to release them without self. If you want a place where INFJs and INTJs can finally hear the mechanics behind their loyalty, subscribe. Each week, I bring a new map out of these traps, but what emerges is not healing. It is dependency. The rescued begins to expect saving. The optimized becomes accustomed to being managed. Both parties lose freedom. One shackled by expectation, the other by responsibility. Silence grows in the space where true intimacy should live. And when the weight becomes unbearable, the savior feels abandoned by the very one they tried to save. The cost is profound. In plain savior, we deny others their dignity, their right to fall and rise on their own terms. We also deny ourselves the gift of being loved simply without utility. Sometimes love is not about carrying or correcting, it is about standing side by side in imperfection. To save another is often to strip them of the very freedom that makes love possible. Here is the practice. When you feel the urge to rescue, ask yourself, am I loving this person, or am I trying to protect myself from the pain of their brokenness? The question is sharp, but it reveals the truth. True love does not require saving. True love requires letting go, and if letting go feels like cruelty, perhaps the greater cruelty is in staying, shackling both lives to an illusion of healing that was never yours to give. There are moments when connection strikes like lightning, sudden, fierce, unforgettable. INFJs and INTJs know this electricity well. For the INFJ, the depth of emotional resonance feels like destiny. For the INTJ, the sharp spark of intellectual chemistry feels like permanence. Both mistake rarity for inevitability, as though the unusual must also be eternal. But rarity can deceive. What feels once in a lifetime may, in truth, be only once in context. The INFJ tells themselves, no one else will ever make me feel this seen, while the NTJ whispers, no one else will ever think like this with me. I remember hearing a particular laugh in a crowded room and believing, absurdly, that such a sound could not be replicated in the entire world. It was beautiful. It was also an illusion. Rare bonds become golden cages. The intensity blinds them to harm. The chemistry outweighs the erosion. The sparkle masks the cost. They overstay not because the bond still nourishes, but because the idea of walking away from something rare feels like sacrilege. The pain of leaving is magnified by the fear that nothing equal or greater will come again. But isn't this fear a chain disguised as reverence? And yet, to dismiss rarity altogether would be dishonest. These bonds are real, unforgettable, worthy of memory. The mistake is not in treasuring them, it is in confusing treasure with prison. Sometimes it just hurts. And sometimes the most courageous act is to hold the beauty of what was without making it the cage of what still is. Practice this reversal. Instead of asking, how could I ever leave something so rare? Ask, how could I stay if rarity alone is the reason? The question breaks the illusion's spell. A rare gem loses nothing of its beauty when set aside. Likewise, a rare bond can remain rare, even in memory. Rarity is not destiny. Rarity is simply rarity, and freedom is always more valuable than gold. Some chains are forged not in fire, but in silence. INFJs often endure emotional neglect, without a word, absorbing the absence as though their suffering were proof of love. INTJs, by contrast, may stay in misaligned bonds under the guise of strategic patience, telling themselves the misfit is temporary, a solvable variable. Both fall into the same snare, the belief that enduring without protest is strength. Silence, however, does not purify. The INFJ swallows unmet needs until the body aches with invisible weight. The INTJ calculates future improvement until the present is consumed by delay. I recall the sound of a ticking clock in a dim room, each second echoing like a reminder of how long I had chosen to wait, convinced endurance would one day be rewarded. But endurance without action deepens the chain. The partner accustomed to silence begins to expect it. The relationship adapts to neglect as though it were normal, and slowly, the one enduring vanishes into shadow. Sometimes, it just hurts. And in that pain, a question surfaces: is this faith, or is it self-betrayal? To endure is noble only when chosen freely, not when imposed by fear of loss. Otherwise, what appears as loyalty is simply the slow abandonment of self. Jung warned that unlived life festers in the unconscious. Silent endurance is one such unlived life. The words unsaid, the exit delayed, the boundaries never drawn. Here is the practice. When you catch yourself enduring quietly, pause and ask, if I spoke my need aloud, what is the worst that would happen? If the answer terrifies you, is it not already happened in silence? One sentence can liberate the refusal to endure what destroys the soul. Endurance is not always love. Sometimes it is the very chain that love itself requires us to break. Hope is holy when it is grounded in reality. But hope unmoored becomes a prison. INFJs are prone to hoping that others will one day wake up to the truth of their own growth, as if transformation could be sparked by silent devotion. INTJs, with equal hope, is the last chain to break. INFJs often stay bound by the quiet conviction that one day the other will awake and see, change, transform. INTJs cling to the expectation that logic will eventually win, that given enough time, reason will force alignment. Both mistake endurance for faith, both mistake waiting for love. Yet hope without evidence is not faith, it is illusion. It shackles the soul with promises that never materialize, with tomorrows that never come. I once sat by a window at dawn, watching the first light spill across empty streets, convincing myself that today, at last, the change would arrive, but it never did. Sometimes it just hurts. This fixation disguises itself as loyalty. To abandon hope feels like betrayal. But in truth, it is not hope. For the other, it is fear of emptiness. To release hope is to face the void directly, to admit that the bond may never deliver what the soul longs for. And that confrontation terrifies both INFJ and INTJ alike. But the paradox is sharp. Letting go of false hope is an act of power. It is to reclaim energy wasted on fantasy and invest it in the reality of one's own becoming. Jung would remind us that the unlived future is also part of the shadow what we project outward because we cannot yet birth it within. The hope we pin on the other may in fact be our own dormant potential, waiting to be claimed. If when I described that hidden exhaustion INFJs and INTJs carry, you thought that's exactly me, tap the like button now. That's how I know these deeper dives into Jung's shadow and emotional chains are worth bringing here so you can get clarity exactly when you need it most. Here's the practice. When you feel yourself waiting for change, ask, has this person shown me, in action, that transformation is real? Or am I living in a story I've written for them? The first answer liberates, the second condemns. True hope does not chain, it frees. And when false hope is cut away, what remains is not despair but clarity. For only in the empty space can a new, real bond begin. There is a quiet seduction in sacrifice. INFJs give until their own identity dissolves into the needs of another, believing that such surrender is proof of love. INTJs lay down long-term goals and visions to preserve fragile bonds, convinced that compromise is the highest form of loyalty. Both confuse erosion with devotion, as though losing oneself were a noble offering at love's altar. But love that devours the self is not love, it is martyrdom. The INFJ empties themselves, silently hoping the other will notice the cost. The INTJ bends their path, silently expecting that sacrifice will one day be repaid. I remember closing my notebook one evening, leaving unfinished plans behind, telling myself that protecting the bond was more important than the dream that had once ignited me. The silence of that compromise still echoes. The spiral tightens in shadows. Each act of giving makes the giver less visible, less alive, less free. The partner accustomed to such sacrifice begins to take it as the norm, and the one sacrificing disappears into their own absence. Sometimes it just hurts, and in the hollow that remains, resentment grows like weeds in neglected soil. Real love is not the obliteration of boundaries, but their sanctification. To say no is not abandonment, it is fidelity to what makes love possible. Kierkegaard once warned that despair comes when we refuse to be ourselves, self-sacrificed when it erases identity is despair in slow motion. To break the spiral, one must reclaim the simple right to exist as a full self in the presence of the other. Here's the practice. When you feel the urge to give past your limit, pause and ask, if I give this, will I still recognize myself tomorrow? If the answer is no, then the act is not love but self-betrayal. To refuse such sacrifice is not cruelty. It is the only way to make room for love that sees, honors, and cherishes both souls fully alive. The greatest tether is not always love, nor loyalty, nor even hope, it is fear. For INFJs, it is the dread of silence after letting go. The haunting sense that, without the bond, the world will collapse into unbearable solitude. For INTJs, it is the terror of wasted years, the thought that to lead is to admit the investment of time and energy was in vain. Both remain bound, not by the other, but by the void that departure reveals. This fear makes emptiness appear as death. The INFJ stares into the silence and feels it as abandonment. The INTJ calculates the lost return and feels it as failure. I remember walking out of an apartment at midnight, the door clicking shut behind me, and hearing the hollow echo of the hallway. It sounded like freedom, but also like loss too vast to measure. Yet emptiness is not always an ending, it can be initiation. The silence that follows release is not absence but space. a clearing where the soul can breathe again. Sometimes it just hurts. But the pain of emptiness is the pain of detoxed spirit, shedding what no longer sustains, making room for what might yet arrive. The paradox lies here. What is feared as nothingness is often the first taste of freedom. To sit in the quiet, to let the void expand, is to discover that the self remains intact, alive, even radiant. Emptiness is not the collapse of identity, but its rebirth. Here is the practice. When you fear the hollow that comes after release, do not rush to fill it. Sit with it. Let it ask you. Ask what if this emptiness is not punishment, but permission. The question reframes the void as gift, for in the stillness beyond attachment, love begins again not as captivity, but as freedom. Every attachment trap has the same root, fear disguised as devotion. To break the chains is not to discard love, but to strip away the illusions that strangle it. Real love does not demand saving or sacrifice. It does not thrive on silence or false hope. It honors freedom, not control. It is the courage to release, and in releasing, to discover what remains true. For INFJs, real love begins when they are seen without the burden of saving, when their empathy is received as gift rather than exploited as resource. For INTJs, real love emerges when partnership is built without domination, when loyalty is no longer the mask of control but the soil of trust. I have learned this truth painfully. I only began to taste real love the moment I allowed myself to let go of what I thought was irreplaceable. As we get into the myth of perfect understanding, think of someone you know who clings to that hope and keeps getting hurt. Sharing this video with them might be the turning point. They'll see that letting go isn't failure, but the first act of freedom. Breaking chains requires shadow work, the discipline of naming hidden motives, of confronting the fears that keep us bound. It requires boundaries that are not walls, but living edges, protecting both self and other. And above all, it requires the courage to step into emptiness, trusting that what is real will remain and what is false will fade. Sometimes it just hurts, and yet in that hurt, clarity rises like dawn. The paradox is luminous. Only by releasing false bonds can true connection be born. What we call loss is often the soil of renewal. What we call betrayal of the past is, in truth, fidelity to the future. Real love is not the tightening of chains, it is their breaking. Here is the practice. Hold this truth as a final anchor. If a bond demands that you abandon yourself, it is not love. To break such chains is not the end of connection, but its beginning. For in the silence after release, love is reborn not as attachment, but as freedom, as vision, as truth. And only there does the soul finally rest unchained.